Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in what is going to be a fantastic panel. I'm overjoyed that we could put four incredibly talented and very well experienced data practitioners, all female, because I think it's important that in data these days we are starting to look at diversity as a true asset to what we do. So the panel is going to be about I think what you've done here, you're kind of giving us a sort of a token of faith, because on the agenda there wasn't that much about what this panel is about. It's CDO perspective. So as good data people, probably we should start from disambiguation of the terms. The D in the CDO is not digital, it's data, Chief Data Officer. And what we're going to chat about today is not the university, not the leading edge, but really what we do in corporations today to tackle this new problem for us. The ethics has been a problem since the moment in which we start to use data, but probably AI and some regulation with 4 letters we're not going to mention anymore, because you had a lot of emails talking about that. That pushed onto our desks a lot more. The need for my mic is going and going. Should I move a bit? Is it all right? Can you hear me? Yeah. The need for us to tackle this as a true business problem. So, introduction, I will have my panelists introducing themselves in a second, but as an introduction, as it says there, I was the former Chief Data Officer. I'm the former Chief Data Officer from Lloyds Banking Group. And I know, I said, what should I do with my mic? Can you help me?
Do you want me to start talking?
No, okay, that's all right. I will pass it on immediately. So before that, I was in GE Capital, General Electric Capital, and I've been falling in love with this data thing since 2014. But the reality, in my mind, was already there ages ago. Because if you are an IT guy that's been trying to sort out BI for the business, you will know that you can't really deliver things if your data is not right. So with that, I will pass it on to the people on my left here, and I'll let them to introduce themselves.
Hi there, my name is Lorraine Waters. I'm the Chief Data Officer for Financial Crime Risk at HSBC. I've been doing this role now for almost 3 years, and prior to that I was the HSBC Group's Head of Data Governance. I joined there in about 2013. Prior to that I was consulting for a while on data strategy, and before that I was Head of Data at RBS. And I've sort of come into the data field about 10 years ago or so, seeing the opportunities, understanding that sort of data touches everything we do. Prior to that, my background was more in change management and operations and strategy. But data is where it's at these days, so hopefully we'll have an interesting panel for you.
Yes, Helen?
Yes, good morning still, people. I'm Helen Crooks. I'm Chief Data Officer at Lloyds of London. I think my mic is also acting up. I've been working with data for the last 35 years. So I actually started working with data straight out of university. And the journey has been quite incredible, but the approach actually doesn't change. So I'm looking forward to actually talking about AI as a particular tool set and what that can actually influence the way in which we think about data. A little bit more background on me. As I say, I've been at Lloyds of London Insurance Brokers, not the bank.
No, it's different. I never met this person before.
That's not true, Roberto. I've been at, say, Lloyds of London Insurance Market for the last, can I use that mic? Yeah. Sorry. For the last 3 years. Prior to that, I was working a lot in consumer and in retail. Some of you well know that I worked on the original loyalty marketing systems for dunnhumby back in the 90s. And I've also worked on a whole approach to how you look at customer data and what it means for customers and the impact of that 4-letter acronym, which I am going to say, which is GDPR, which has really brought everything to the fore. So this is a very timely discussion for me.
Let's try. No, let's try your mic.
I tried.
So Susan.
Okay, doesn't work.
So Susan Wegner, I'm within Deutsche Telekom, responsible for the data. And as Helen, I must admit, so I studied computer science and math, and I'm with data for a long time. In my PhD, I already programmed neural networks. At that time, you can imagine it took us for a small image, like the whole night, to get just a result for a very, very small image. But at Deutsche Telekom, I'm responsible for the overall data governance, data strategy, including data architecture, data models, data analytics for the whole group. So for example, working especially how to access data, how to normalize data, and really bringing the scalability into the company and working closely together with all our countries, all our business units. And as most of the panel can imagine, this is really a challenge because we have different people there, always put together diverse teams. So we will talk about it later on.
So hi, my name is Wallace, and I'm analytics strategist with IBM. And everybody asks, what's an analytics strategist do? Well, I'm nearly 20 years, I can't believe it, nearly 20 years building AI technology. I started back building some of the original NLP technology and natural language processing that's now inside IBM Watson. And then in the last probably decade, I got a bit more interested in the human side of data, so analyzing the data that people lay down as they move through their digital lives, so social networks, collaboration networks, to do things like recommendation systems, smart assistants, reputation analysis systems, influence analysis, so a range of analytics. I've recently moved into blockchain, and you're going to wonder why blockchain? Now, everybody else is moving into blockchain these days, but there was a very specific reason. So if anything that I've learned over the last 2 decades, is that data is our life's blood. Data is the fuel that runs our systems, and without data, everything comes to a standstill. So the data supply chain is critical to our existing. And the second thing is particularly in the last decade, as I've worked on human data, the complexities of using data and everything from privacy and ethics and data protection to data equity, these are really, really tricky problems. The reason I moved into our IBM blockchain incubator was to explore the question, can blockchain help us build a new data supply chain which is more equitable, where every citizen and every corporation, not just the big guys, but every corporation can participate in the data ecosystem, can participate and also benefit from. Because fundamentally, in much the same way as currency needs to flow through markets for innovation to happen, in this data-driven world, data needs to freely flow in order for innovation to happen. And this can't happen unless we have a new way of thinking about data and how data flows. And this is one of the interesting challenges and interesting opportunities, I think, with blockchain around kind of self-sovereign identity and owner-mediated data exchange. So that, I'm hoping, is maybe one of the future areas that we're looking at within IBM.
So you see, your faith is already being paid back. So you listen from 4 different kind of industries, and there is a lot we already put out there. So I will start with a bit of a now deep dive into when did you start to think about data ethics as a problem in your own personal journey? Well, can you picture in your head a moment where you say, maybe we should start to do something different? Susan, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'm coming from the innovation department, so when we started to work on projects more seriously, like 3 years ago, we started already to have some guidelines, and at that time we did it with our privacy department. What we had recently, I believe 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had within our company really official guidelines on our web page, and it's really not that it's finalized, it's more for discussions, and within our own, we have an internal social network. It's a lot of discussion about it, and that brings it really into every unit within Deutsche Telekom. And basically, the guideline is as in the presentation before, so principles about how to control it, how to look at it, that we are still have humans who control everything. So we have a first draft of guidelines, but the initial thing is 3 years ago.
And we'll talk more about next steps. And Helen, you want to?
Yeah, because I want to come back to, say we're talking about data and we're talking about the ethics of use. If you look back over the last 20, 30 years, personal experience, if you're looking back at the Tesco Dunnhumby use of data, the ethical use of that data was always in the background, but it was actually couched in terms of the customer's, what rights the customer had.
Treating customer fairly.
Yeah, treating the customer fairly, and that was ethically embedded, whether people liked Tesco or not. It was ethically embedded in the way in which Tesco wanted to treat their customers and to make sure that there was some value proposition, some value offering off the back of it. So for me, it's been there for a long time in terms of understanding about, well, this actually means we need to actually think about what we're doing with the data. Coming forward a little bit more, I think it's now that people are so much more aware. We're all so much more aware. We're generating so much data. How you embed that into a company's practice, the values, the ethos, without getting embroiled in the whole argument over legal and compliance, so the values and ethics, is the challenge that we face.
Yes. What do you think? Probably you not grab.
I think
No, yours is not working.
Okay.
We decided to kill old mics.
Okay. So, similar to the lady who presented from the University of Bath, this is not a new thing. What we call data ethics is simply just good data governance. In the banking world, we set out the risks that we want to manage. One of those would be information security risk or data risk, and we put frameworks around it, including controls, including standards and policies. So I think, similar to Tesco back in the day with the loyalty card, we've always been thinking about this and trying to ensure that we do treat the customer fairly, and also that if we look on data as an asset, similar to how we manage money and customer relationships and technologies are assets, and so we would wrap that level of governance and protection around that asset. So I think the standard tools and frameworks that we use can adapt to this. AI is not something brand new. I think if we treat all of our data, including improving the development and the testing around how we deploy AI and keep the code transparent, as you say, then that's a decent level of protection around it. It's my view.
So elaborating on that one, and I think there is all the lab to life, but the role of the data leader into this, what is it? Are we leading? Are we fostering? Are we, corralling? What is it?
Well, I think every single individual in a company has got a responsibility around data. Probably every one of us in our firms can create it or correct it or delete it. So it can't just be the data leader. The data leader needs to set down the policy and the standards and the frameworks. And beyond that, I think a company's values, another word for ethics, a company's values will ensure that you have high standards around the protection of assets and the control of data as an asset.
So as we were saying on Friday, the ethics thing is an extension. Data ethics should be seen an extension of your values. It's just something that should dovetail with that.
Absolutely, and the respect that you hold your customer and your employees in.
And Mary, from kind of the IBM point of view, I mean, how would you talk to people like data practitioners and say, well, your role into this should be more that, or how you see companies tackling that?
So as a data scientist, I definitely think the data leaders and the CDOs need to lead by example. But I think fundamentally we can't, data scientists, both the people who generate the AI and the people who consume it can't abdicate responsibility to the CDOs. Because in my experience of working in this space, I haven't met anybody who's consciously wanted to do something that was unethical. The problem isn't that we consciously want to do something, but we inadvertently do something. So it could be a data scientist who creates a really, really great algorithm to identify reputation. So this is an area that I worked on, to identify reputation. And then that's a really interesting piece of information. It could be a very valuable piece of information for the individual to know about. But if you then start to use that information and allow the HR departments to consume that for promotions, then it totally changes the purposes of that, changes the accuracy that you need to have. It changes a whole set of things. So in my experience, I think what we really need is we need values, we need them documented, but it's back to the earlier presentation about kind of the maturity of the AI development process, the architecture. We really need to fundamentally add some discipline into how we build AI to ensure that we don't inadvertently, because it's the inadvertent accidents that cause the problems, not anybody intentionally trying to be unethical.
And Susan, what's your how you see your role in Deutsche Telekom in the regards of data ethics and ethics in general?
So what we are doing right now is really two things. Really driving the topic within Deutsche Telekom, and driving, and you all mentioned it, the data governance. And we have, I must say, in this thing, the advantage that we have the GDPR, so we can hook back on that one and bringing really our principles together with the overall privacy thing and the overall implementation of data topics, data governance within DT, and bringing these principles into really implementation, and we are driving that with our team.
Helen, anything you want to add to?
Not from a sort of an overall practice perspective, because I think we all have the same view in terms of the need for a
we were
business.
disagreeing so well on
No,
Friday.
well, I don't know. I don't think we do disagree.
Okay. I was on the wrong call then.
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge, and especially the challenge for the role I have in Lloyds, is the bigger picture impact of AI on the way in which the world actually operates, and how that could inadvertently potentially disadvantage different people with respect to how they get particular forms of insurance. And I think starting to explore, and there's a lot of discussion, to explore those boundaries as to where we need governance, where we need regulation, where we need company ethics, where we need compliance, is a big topic, and we've got to get some movement on laying the foundations down before we actually end up in a position where we've got too little governance and control, which comes back to the previous presentation.
But stay on that, on the governance and control, because I guess most of the people at this conference are the guys that want to move agile in an agile way, right? Whenever you say governance to them, they say, oh, God, right? So is this going to be a cost? I mean, taking control of ethics and data ethics is going to be a cost. It's going to be, stifling growth. How we deal with that?
So from my personal perspective on this...
Of course, it's a rhetorical question.
I know, but personal perspective on this is this isn't additional cost. It's something we've been doing for the last X many years as we've dealt with different regulations and different management of data practices. So keep the same ethos, but make sure you have it extending to the whole of the company, irrespective of whether or not they've got the word innovation or AI in the title.
But what would you say to companies that today are not regulated, although you might argue that GDPR is kind of regulating all of us?
Exactly. I think that is not an excuse anymore. Okay. The other point is that this is not something which is a policing, a regulatory element. This is an ethical approach to how you do business. And I'm sure most companies go in, even Cambridge Analytica went in thinking they were operating in an ethical way. So how do you write down those ethics? How do you make them something that's clear that you're happy to talk about, that your compliance and legal team are happy for you to talk about. And that's I think, our biggest challenge, not the actual governance or the data governance or the management, because those things are there.
And Lorraine, from your point of view, I mean, in the financial crime, I mean, this is probably, it's kind of a razor blade, right? You have to be very, very good at maintaining the risk appetite for your company, at the same time, how that will infringe into the bubble of privacy of your customers. So how you do, and is this a cost again? Is seen as something that is going to be adding to your cost?
We really don't see it as a cost. You know, even in the sort of agile development methodology, we just have to embed this in the consciousness and the user stories of all of our developers, all of our architects, all of our change agents. And we've done that, you know, starting 5 years ago. One of the pillars of our data governance framework was to ensure that we educated and trained people to understand what good data governance might look like. Probably nobody in this room is, in any doubt what that might look like. But 5 years ago, in an IT department or in a transformation team, they wouldn't necessarily have understood the importance of well-defined, consistently defined data, and wrapping some, controls around the data that we believe to be most important. So we don't see it as a cost; we see it as an absolute necessity. The same way with, the testing controls that you would have in the software development life cycle. You need to just make sure that they are robust and they are followed, and it's just a part of the job.
So it's all about designing for this.
It is about putting those foundational capabilities in place and designing for this, and particularly the way things are moving. And you can imagine in financial crime, the goalposts keep changing. So you have to be able to deliver in a very agile manner at scale the vast amounts of data that we are looking at. So we have to employ AI capabilities to help us to do that. But we have to make sure that we are entirely consistent with the legitimate use case that we have in AML and KYC.
So Susan, going fast and breaking things in ethics doesn't work. We found out, right? No. So what from an innovation point of view, do you think something that can be embedded in innovation, or something again is going to slow down innovation? No. By the way, I saw no question yet on Slido, and as a fifth panelist, you're kind of disappointed me a little bit. I thought you were being given the code. So, do we know the code? CogX 18. Well, with a lot of imagination. But if you have questions, you can actually run to you with this mic, because we know this one works, and we can have a question. Any questions? There's a question from there. I can run to you with the mic.
Thank you very much. Very interesting conversation. I'm curious what the panel is doing with regards to embedding ethical frameworks within their AI. So in other words, if you have a set of rules, a set of ethics that you wanted to teach your machine, how would you do it? And can you codify that as part of your AI framework? Then it's not a tax, it doesn't slow things down, it actually becomes part of the innovation.
That was more or less the question I was asking Susan. So, yeah. That's good moderation, eh, Gary?
So what I think because what we have, I already mentioned this principles we have, and what we are doing right now is really doing an overall education over the overall company to really bring that into the company. The next thing is that we have close connections to all developers. We have different communities, and I don't see that it will take longer, because if you have it in there from the beginning and it is clear what you have to do, then it shouldn't be longer to really implement that. It's the only thing that really takes long is really to get this new mindset really into a company that didn't do like AI before, and you need a lot of education there to bring that into a company.
Anyone wants to add? Mary, you want to add something?
Well, I was just going to say that we're still, in a similar way, we're still fundamentally at the the education stage and describing what ethics really means and what values mean as it relates to when you're building technology, because there's a series of steps, so the development process needs to change in order to factor that in. So at this stage, we're not, at least within the company, I'm not currently involved in the actual codifying of the ethics, because I think fundamentally we're still trying to translate that into something that's meaningful for the AI systems that we're building.
How about that? Our fifth panelist has actually woken up. Once you give them the code, they actually can, and they have questions. Shall I go for this one? Yeah. One is very interesting, is from Rich Littleday. Facebook's recent data challenge, were they a failure of governance or a failure of culture or both? Okay, next one. Thank you, Rich. You just froze my panel. Thank you very much, Rich. Where are you? Thank you.
So that was a fear of governance from a Facebook perspective.
Or culture, or both.
Culture or both. It's really hard because having sat on panels with people from Facebook and Apple and Google, I've seen different legal positions from all those different companies. And I can honestly say that you can see the different ethical feeling coming out between them. So I would agree that Facebook haven't, from my perspective, I think they've been operating a little bit blind or a little bit naive and not thinking that they need to actually address this problem up front, and have been caught out a little bit. Whether that is true or not, I don't think any of us will ever know. I don't think that these investigations will get to the bottom of exactly how they worked. But I do believe that it's presented a challenge that means that now everybody is having to make that decision. How you embed that back into your own individual company's ethos and ethics is the big challenge. Really, really big challenge when you've got companies that, you know, a bit like Lloyds, who are not, they're very old, they've got traditional ways of working. So it's our job to actually do that translation.
Anyone having other views?
Yeah, and I obviously would say this because I've just moved into blockchain to think about data supply chain. But I think that the challenge as well for Facebook, and it's a challenge for everybody who has data, is that fundamentally the data supply chain is actually a problem, in the sense that, you know, you've got data can be taken because of either breaches, so the security breaches, which the very fact that you've got data all over the place, you've got lots of points of entry, you've got lots of weaknesses. So I think that creates a problem. And also I think you've got process problems again, because the process and the methodology around the data, you know, people can get it, but they just assume they'll trust somebody not to do anything with it afterwards. And then also I think that the supply and demand issue of data is a problem. You know, the fact that for innovations, for small startups, for academics, it is so difficult to get access to data that everybody screen scrapes. I mean, everybody gets data by whichever means they can. And I think until such time as we come to terms with the whole challenge of the data supply chain, I think we're going to see more and more of these Facebook examples from countries across the board that have data.
Okay, so the other one would be, and actually it's very relevant to this panel, is how can we use data to challenge our gender stereotypes in the products we create, rather than enforcing them, the society's biases. And I can give you one example. I was talking to someone, and they, as a publisher, and they publish books for kids, and they realized that we're actually, when a parent was going there and searching for books for kids, once they were saying the gender, they were inputting the gender of their kids, then the pages were like, if it's a girl, it's going to be all unicorn and pink and stuff like that, and if it's a boy, it's going to be space and, you know, and battles and wars. So that's gender stereotypization. So, and we probably do it at an unconscious level. So is it a problem? Is it a true problem? How we go around this problem? Susan. Give it a mobile with a pink background.
Yeah, I was last week on a panel with a professor about like a really psychologist and our HR department exactly on that topic. And we were all like thinking about how to do it, how to really have not only really gender in there, but diversity in general. And it's really a cultural problem, like Lloyd said. It will take a little bit, and we really have to think in companies how to really have the diversity in there. So for example, if you look at our board, it was very nice when our HR person said, a year before, I could never imagine that we would have a board with someone from India, with someone from the US. We have women there, so very divided diversity for a pure German company. So, but it's taking really small steps, and especially in departments that work on traditional things and in technology. I can tell you, if I go there, I see only German white men there.
So if I can paraphrase, if the management of company is not aware of a gender stereotypization, is not appreciating of diversity, that will reflect into your products.
Yes, yes, that.
But you know, similar to the presentation from the lady from the University of Bath, you know, now that we're able to identify through the analytics and see where we are unearthing biases and stereotypes, we can avoid the prejudice. So, you know, and that's research that she's only just come up with, you know, less than a year ago, and they're looking at the labor stats in the US. So it's so powerful. We can do that within our own company now to start to, you know, take positive, affirmative steps, you know, not just in our products, but in our processes and in the culture as well.
And can I just, you know, to extend on that, so when we built this system to do reputation analysis and to look at careers, and again, as the lady from Bath pointed out, the data we're training on is ultimately biased, because if we're looking, for example, oh, there's a lot of men that are computer programmers, and so you could then train the system to assume certain things based on the flawed data. And this is the reason why we built a hybrid approach, which I really like. Now, it has its own challenges. By hybrid approach, what I mean is there's fundamental, it's not so much principles, because it wasn't necessarily about gender, but fundamental theories about learning, about education, about skills, about development. So there was fundamental theories that have been developed over 50 years, long before tech, that we were able to incorporate into our models. So to combine, so again, I guess to combine, you know, data that what we learn from the data, but also what we fundamentally know as human beings, or what we fundamentally would like to know. So we'd like to have more women doing X, Y, and Z, or we'd like to have more diversity. So I think it really is important when you do know that the data is ultimately biased, to figure out ways that you can tune or tailor the AI, because the problem I've also found, and I'm sure people can address this, is that as soon as you build analytics, all the line of business love AI, and they don't really understand whether it works, but they just love it anyway. So if you give them something that doesn't actually work perfect, they'll take it and they'll make decisions based on that. So I think it's really important and incumbent on us as data scientists to make sure that we either try to fix some of the biases, or we really, really clearly communicate them when we provide the technology to line of business.
To the point, Helen, there's another question from Anonymous. I hope it's not the guy that is hacking the world, but should we regulate the data we are allowed to use in ML models, e.g. gender, and or regulate how the model outputs are used? You don't want to take that?
You know, in some jurisdictions we are already, you know, not allowed to capture gender, and that's the US, for example. So I think we're doing that already. You know, I think it was you that mentioned earlier on that, you know, we should be looking at making more data available rather than looking at what we can and cannot see, you know, to help all organizations. And in the UK, we are actually leading on that. I don't know if people have come across open banking, but you're going to be allowing the data from other organizations to be made available online. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. And the GovID is also another UK initiative to ensure that you know, its citizens' data is becoming more freely available to the data scientists, to the non-profits, to the like Turing Institute, etc. So, you know, I think it's a good thing, and we shouldn't legislate to hide the data.
No, I'd agree. I think that the regulation, the legislation that we have around protecting consumer rights and protecting people's data is the way in which we should go forward. We shouldn't look specifically at the regulatory perspective of just because it's an AI engine, just because it's working in that particular space, that you would actually want to restrict the level of data that goes through it. I think you need to bring it back to the human element, the people piece, and make sure it's focused on the individual and their data, no matter what you're doing with it.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Yeah, there's a question there. You want me to run to you? I'll run to you. I hope I'm not falling.
Thank you. I just had a question on what you find are the best practical methods of implementing training and around data protection, because I've drafted countless policies and they just sit on a shelf and gather dust and no one understands them half the time. So I was just wondering what you found are the most effective ways of kind of embedding it within an organisation.
Anyone from the...
I'll take that one.
Okay, good.
What we've done at Lloyds and what I've done elsewhere as well is multi-tiered different levels of communication and multi-tiered different ways of getting the message across. And it sounds very simple and very obvious, but you can't go on the basis that just because there's a policy in place that people either read it, understand it, embed it. So we're using every different way in which you could think about it. We have very graphical and engaging training modules, some of which are mandatory, some of which aren't. We have training on getting closer to data and understanding. We go around the teams and talk to them directly about the data that they're looking after and what they're using. We use the data card quite a lot in terms of getting messages out across the corporate intranet. Just every channel that you can possibly think of, because as individuals, different people will use and respond to different channels.
And I mentioned earlier that, we had worked with our change teams and our IT teams to train them on the basics of, data management best practice, but also our architects. So ensuring that you have architectural principles around data, that's the first place you go. And then embedding it in your, whether it be Agile or SDLC or your business transformation framework. And that means everybody's got their shoulder to the wheel rather than the CDO. And anything that you can do around, whether it's e-learning or, pumping that out, just repeat. Data is an asset. And on the protection or the privacy side of it as well, we now have an obligation, certainly after GDPR, to ensure that every change we make, we do a privacy impact assessment. So that's embedded, again, in any change framework that an organization should have.
And my personal suggestion is a bit of gamification, right? Because it's surprising what endorphins and dopamines can do instead of sending a policy out. And I always say to the conferences I go, the day in which I will find a way to, I will design a tool that solves data quality issues and looks like Candy Crush Saga, I'm actually sweeping the market. There was a question.
Yeah, can I just add one quick point on that, though, just to reinforce the integrating into the process of building things. That, for me, if you want the people who are building your AI to understand it, they won't read anything, for sure. But if it's part of the process, if they want to access data, because I think one of the things I'm a bit concerned about, I love GDPR, I think principally it's great. I think one of the things it's going to do is going to make people afraid to do anything with data. So it'll stymie innovation, or people will kind of do really weird stuff. So I just think it has to be integrated into the life of people who are building these solutions.
Yes, and my question is, okay, data, so what? I mean, the main issue is there is a strategy of how you use the data that usually does not exist, even in GDPR. For instance, the main issue is the strategy that should lead the GDPR and create economy. That is the what for me.
Okay. So I think the point is if I can paraphrase what you're saying is, so you have the data, and then what? I mean, at the end of the day, you can talk ethics all the time, but there should be an outcome you are trying to achieve, right? and therefore the strategy leading that. I think we are kind of all in agreement with that, unless there are any
I can just say, because data is one thing, but to get really the business insight out of the data and to really have cases that bring business impact and really scale, that's really essential, because no one will hear about data quality and stuff like that if you don't have really the business impact. So So what we have is really we are putting together really like the priority cases of the company and really looking at it, what will bring the highest business impact, and where we are really getting from different countries the same request for cases. And then you have to look at the effort, because is the effort relatively high, then it's probably not such a good idea. But if we have really good cases from the business impact, and that we can say we can realize it relatively quickly, then do it for different countries and implement it only once and not 5 times or so.
And that's why whenever I go into a new job and people say, give me your data strategy, I say, no, you give me your business strategy, and then I'll give you my data strategy, right? So can I take one question from here? Detlef has got 3 likes, so it's a good question. And it's actually along the lines of what we should have discussed anyway, roundabout now, which is many companies have published their approach to data ethics and privacy. Have you looked at publishing your stance on ethics in AI, which is far wider? And it was more the point about, is the publishing of your stance on ethics in general, is it a double-edged sword, or is something that you should do? And you're done if you do it, you're done if you don't anyway.
Well, I think the point is that we are doing it already. It's not a new policy that we need to be creating. We just need to make sure that the existing controls and frameworks that we have wrap around AI. You know, what we're doing with AI is really just the same as what we were doing when we had less data. But now we have a lot more data, and it's moving at a much greater pace. So, you know, wrap the same, transparent terms and conditions, policies, standards, controls, assurance, testing around your AI. Models management as well.
I think the question is, would you put on an advert somewhere, like you're doing an advert maybe, oh, we help Britain, or we do this for the society. Would you put another advert that say, and by the way, we are treating your data ethically? I think that's so publishing in the wider sense of, I guess, Detlef, that's what you meant, right? Or you, Detlef? Yeah, that's what you meant. Yeah, good.
And there's 2 parts to my answer on this. The first is, I'll come back to the, are we publishing what we're doing about data and AI in an ethical way. The first thing is that from a Lloyds perspective, Lloyds is interesting because it operates a market. And that means we have regulatory oversight of a lot of companies that operate in that market. In fact, there might even be some people from the market in the room. I don't know. But Lloyds has to tread a very fine line between being a regulator and being a company that can project and encourage the take-up of more insurance. Now, as we get into cyber, as we get into the impact of AI on society and the impact of that on individuals and on cities and on insurance, we're having to make some quite strong statements about where we are going to go from respect to a governance and a regulatory perspective and not. So for me, there is an interesting challenge coming up, because we haven't solved it yet, as to how we start to state what our regulatory oversight is with respect to the ethical position of what people are doing with AI in the insurance industry. And then if you come back to will you publish it, and that comes down to then is whether or not your legal and compliance people are happy for you to talk about ethics. Now, I've seen a number of consumer organisations take the challenge of what are we ethically doing with data and turning into a customer proposition where you can talk about the ethics, but without mentioning the ethics word. And I think that's where we're going to end up on a consumer engagement perspective, is if you start talking about ethics too much, you'll get into the legal, you'll get into the compliance, and you will stifle the conversation that you actually need to be having with your end consumers and with your end customers. So I would encourage people to always think about it in terms of that angle of, actually, this is about customer relations. It's not just about ethics.
Can I take there was a question here, right? You wanted to ask?
Yeah, I guess I found this really interesting, and in two key ways. You talk about ethics as a problem, which I think is interesting because it tells us about the perspective, and it's not a criticism. But I would imagine for companies that are seeking to gain advantage by using data, then any restrictions to that use of data is indeed a problem for that. But it strikes me that there are well-trodden paths, not always successful, in ways in which ethical practice in companies can facilitate the free flow of data. For example, we have the Open Data Institute here talking about some such processes. And I wanted to ask the panel whether or not they could see a charter mark of some description which would assert that the company, so it would work in the following way, that a consumer or a provider of data would be happy to release their data to those companies who had this charter mark, who had embedded within their AI systems certain ethical standards for the ways in which their AI operate, but their data would not be released. There would be no free flow of data to any other company. And that system could be adopted voluntarily across companies. It doesn't question the morality of business, because frankly, we could have an entire conference just on that. Let's just move on to the fact that businesses are places where innovation takes place, and sometimes they have to break boundaries in order to do that. To facilitate that while still being responsive to consumers is something that I think can be an added advantage for some of the businesses.
Okay, panel?
Yeah, I do think it would be, so as a consumer, working with a company or using a company's product, I think over time we've seen certain things become just standard. Like, for example, green. People, there's the green sign. You know, they want to know they're buying something that's green, that doesn't use child labor. There's a whole set of things that people now, consumers expect when they work with companies. And expect, although you never know, that will indeed become the way with data, you know, because we've seen so many of these scandals recently that I think the consumer will increasingly want to know, are you a company that I can trust with my data? Now, whether like a mark, like some sort of, you know, whatever, whether that becomes an easier way to have that dialogue with the consumer is an interesting idea. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we definitely absolutely need to make it easy for consumers to understand what our position is, and not just our position from an ethical or from a value standpoint, but actually from an implementation standpoint. You know, how secure is our data? You know, are we going to have data breaches? And we kind of do that already today, but it's whether or not we need to think about it more broadly. It's not just banks, but it's every organization out there that may be collecting data about us.
Yeah, and the other piece I would add on to that is it's not about the release of that data. It's about how you operate with that data within the organisation. Though I'm totally supportive of the ODI. I understand what's coming there.
Okay, so because we're on the final stretch, right? We're just 5 minutes and people probably are going to have a lunch and we have a little thing at the end we want to do. So just a quick 1 minute each in terms of next steps. So what are the next steps? Are they the ones you are thinking and implementing, or the ones you really would like to be implemented across your organization and maybe the industry as a whole?
You know, I think the training, the education, the awareness, you know, needs to go filter out beyond the data organization into everybody's roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, I'd like to see this conversation taking place much more broadly. I think it's starting to bubble up, but I think organisations, when they're looking at their values and their ethics, need to actually address this as part of that.
Yeah. So for me, diversity is really key here. Not only the education, but really have diverse teams for all the stuff. So that's really one of the things we are driving at the moment, really have people from really different perspectives in there. That's always the best, because then you have all views, all opinions integrated in there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for me, it's about the data supply chain, you know, and not just as a company IBM is interested in, but something that's an open effort. You know, there's a lot of W3C work right now around standards that were much the same way as we did standards for the internet, doing standards for the internet of identity and the notion of self-sovereign identity and open communities. So I think this whole area of the data supply chain from an owner-mediated standpoint, I think is something which is going to be critical to all of our futures.
And on the word future, I think, can we pull the slide? I think one thing we were discussing with Mary when we met was that as a industry, as a group of people that can make such a big impact on humanity, is astonishing we haven't got a code of conduct. It is. We don't have an Hippocrates oath that we take when we start to do things with data. So what I will ask you is just to stand up and read with me what we're about to read. And in case you're going to agree with that, you may be clapping. If you don't agree with that, you can sit back down. But can you stand up, please? All of you. Come on. Even the ones that are, can you? Oh, yeah. Hello, sir. So, next. I solemnly pledge to practice my profession with conscience and dignity. To respect the privacy of the people whose data is confided in me. To maintain the utmost respect for the individuals whose data I'm analyzing. Come on, I want to say the voices. You want to be transparent, open, and honest about the type of analysis I'm applying to their data. Except in financial crime. Always take derogation. To never, never, never use my knowledge to violate human rights and civil liberties, even under threat. That's a big one, guys. That's it for our panel. Thank you very much for your fantastic collaboration.